Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening at the Alberta Trans Studies Teach-In. My name is Celeste Pang. I'm an assistant professor at Mount Royal University and co-director of the Critical Hub. I'm one of the co-organizers and moderators of tonight's event. We would like to begin by acknowledging and asking you all to take a moment to reflect on the lands that we are joining tonight's conversation from. I myself am joining from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Yarhe Nakota, as well as Métis Nation District 6. Our panelists are joining from territories across lands in southern Alberta, and we have attendees, over 700 of you so far, from across Turtle Island. As we proceed in this conversation, we encourage you to think about the connections between settler colonialism and the events we are discussing, and how we can engage in collective decolonial efforts. This event is organized and hosted by the Critical Queer and Trans Research Hub. We are a new research hub based at Mount Royal University with the mandate to serve as a connector and intellectual meeting place for 2S LGBTQIA+ faculty, students, and broader community, locally and provincially. You can read more about the hub at criticalhub.com, criticalhub.com. There you can find information about how to subscribe to our email list, and you can follow us on Instagram at critical.mru. We would like to thank the MRU Faculty of Arts, the Department of Child Studies and Social Work, and the Mount Royal Faculty Association for their financial support of this event. We would also like to thank the 2S LGBTQ+ Health Hub for supporting ASL interpretation, and we are grateful to our pals at Athabasca's J Series for connecting us with our interpreters, Alana and Monica, for this event. Over to you, Corinne.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Corinne Mason. I'm a professor and the coordinator of Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Royal University, and I'm also the co-director of the new Critical Hub here at the university. And I want to say that we haven't quite launched yet. We were supposed to have our official launch on March 1st, and so here we are launching in a very unexpected way, and of course under inhospitable conditions here on Treaty 7. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you for kind of rolling with us as the panelists changed and the shape and form of this event changed, and just how quickly it came together. I want to say a little bit about what motivated this particular event and how I think we're thinking about it at the Hub. And so very honestly, I just kind of was not sleeping as a parent of a trans child and as a non-binary person with lots of chosen fam, very worried about what's happening in this context. And so I, instead of trying to wrestle with sleep, I started writing emails to my colleagues and scheduled a send for an appropriate time in the morning to try and put something together. And so what we started with was really just speaking to colleagues and really trying to flesh out our connections and flesh out our networks in the Alberta context in order to find folks who could come around a table and speak about the multiple kind of buckets as we see them with what was announced in the anti-trans policies from Danielle Smith's government just last week. And so we were really looking for folks who could speak to education, who might be able to speak to healthcare, and who might speak to sport, and then folks who give us an otherwise kind of grounded and rounded context for the emergence of these policies and their impact. And so as a research hub, what we're focused on in terms of our efforts here is really bringing together trans scholars, trans scholarship in the Alberta context. And of course, this panel is not reflective of trans communities more generally, especially at the intersections of race and indigeneity. There's so many voices missing from this conversation, and there's so much expertise outside of the academic industrial complex that is not represented on this particular panel. We know that community organizations, clinicians who serve trans communities have an understanding of these policies that are essential to this conversation, as do trans youth who know themselves best. And we know that grassroots activists are leading, and they will continue to lead the kinds of organizing that we need to see in this moment. And I just want to give a shout out to an MRU historian, Victoria Bullshitz, who's also Karla Marx, and is leading as part of the Queer Citizens United grassroots organization here in Mohkinstsis. So in my view, scholars have a responsibility to ensure that our research is not locked up behind locked away in the ivory tower. And so this is one of many attempts that we will make as scholars to do knowledge sharing work. We're only a week out, maybe even not fully a week out of the announcement of these policies. And so this event should be understood as one of many ways that folks in Alberta are coming together to speak back to these hateful policies, to hate-filled movements, to care for one another, and to spread trans and queer joy, despite those who aim to stoke fear and our despair. And so on that note, it's for security. If we're interrupted by nefarious actors in this moment, we will shut down the webinar, and the panelists and the host will reconvene by email and chat with one another about how we want to seek care in that moment and how we might want to proceed. And so that ends our introductory notes. What we will do now is move to the panelists to give as much time as possible for folks to speak in this teach-in. And so the first person that we're going to hear from is Tobias Wiggins, who is from Athabasca University. Thanks for starting us off, Tobias. I really appreciate it.
No problem. All right. So thanks for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone who's here. Thank you so much for being here, for selling out this teach-in event in only a few days, really, and for showing up with over 1,000 others at the rally at City Hall in Calgary and hundreds in Edmonton over the weekend. In full earnest, I was brought to tears standing in that uplifting and unapologetic crowd with all those who understand the urgency and force with which we must respond to this onslaught of proposed anti-trans legislation. I'm a scholar whose research primarily focuses on transgender mental health, and as a part of that work, I'm very interested in studying the psychology of transphobia, or put in other words, I really like interrogating why cisgender people enact transphobic harms on two-spirit, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. It's an honor to contribute my voice here, and I hope to use my short allotted time to impart some tools that will help us scrutinize and dismantle the UPC's strategic use of concern and care for transgender people. By revealing the function of more hidden or insidious types of transphobic violence, we might be better able to discern why anti-trans disinformation is so contagious, especially in relation to transgender youth. I am sure by now, many of us here have watched the Premier's announcement on Twitter. The video, which could indeed seem like parody for those unfamiliar with Alberta's Premier, opens with the sound of calm, optimistic guitar music, as stock images of people hugging, laughing, giving high fives, no joke, flash in a news anchoress box beside her. Danielle Smith begins her hopeful debasement of transgender human rights with a deceptively benevolent claim. She states, quote, "We as a society must support and reach out with kindness and inclusion to those who identify as transgender. I want every Albertan that identifies as trans to know I care deeply about you and accept you as you are. I will ensure you are supported and your rights are protected," end quote. This completely cringe, disquieting, and paternalistic introduction was, of course, then followed by a laundry list of administrative attacks on the very fabric of trans youth survival. You, like myself, might now be left asking, how is it even possible that such opposing statements hold together for her and in turn for the publics which might take them seriously? Certainly, we can understand Smith's professed care for transgender people as a simple strategic move to soften and conceal the destructive effects of her goals, or perhaps to a diversion to ward off accusations of prejudice. However, I want to highlight an additional dynamic at play, which medical anthropologist Mickey Elster has helpfully called insidious concern. Elster defines insidious concern as a rhetorical move. It's one that forefronts care and concern of trans youth, while also, quote, calling for the destruction of the object of concern, end quote. Through insidious concern, the UCP can position transgender youth as a vulnerable population that needs saving, while simultaneously their supposed saviors can impede access to life-saving healthcare, can forcibly and dangerously out them, and can even take away their ability to play. This sleight of hand not only masks the effects of their actions, but further obscures what is truly being protected through the ever-growing field of transphobic moral panic that has pummeled the United States and is now seeping into Canadian policy. The real concern is not for actual existing trans children and their families. Otherwise, and this goes without saying, they would have been consulted and well-established evidence-based best practices would have been observed. Rather, instead, the insidious concern currently engulfing trans youth works as a placeholder for the preservation of a more sweeping, normative social order. As many queer theorists have argued, in the neoliberal imaginary, the figure of innocent, vulnerable children often symbolically stand in for the protection and the reproduction of white colonial heteronormativity. In this way, the panic surrounding trans children can act as a veil that hides additional underlying cultural anxieties about dominant normative family structures. The nonprofit organization Edmonton Two-Spirit Society has highlighted this dynamic well in their public letter condemning Alberta's parental rights policy. They name that this proposed legislation is, quote, in violation of Indigenous sovereignty, treaty rights, and the traditional laws and culture of Indigenous peoples, end quote. In so doing, they have emphasized an important link between such anti-trans legislation and the continuation of colonial projects in Canada. These are mutually reinforcing projects that restrict Indigenous rights to self-determination, such as determining the parameters of one's own identity, that restrict their right to kinship, such as parental-child relations, and that restrict rights to health and well-being. These issues are deeply interconnected and an essential part of the Premier's false claims to care and support of transgender people. Indeed, her alleged concern can coexist with draconian anti-trans policies because ultimately it's an insidious concern. I have argued that insidious concern not only attempts to destroy the population it supposedly cares for, but further, it conceals the various hegemonic systems that conservative politicians are actually protecting. If we are to effectively fight the discrimination and disinformation that seeks to erase trans childhoods, we must vigilantly tackle these dubious, compassionate claims as they ultimately work to safeguard such overlapping injustices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias. So next we're going to hear from Eva Lagar, who's an MRU alumnus and also a practicing registered nurse.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. I am really deeply honored to be here. The trans scholars on this panel are people that I really look up to. They're my heroes. Sorry, I just saw a message about me being unmuted. Hopefully that was heard. Anyway, I really consider it an honor to be here with my heroes and role models, my trans scholars. So thank you. I've thought a lot about this. I've tried really hard to prepare. It makes my blood run cold. I think children are the future, and that's why this is so scary. I don't think it's a matter of, US politics seeping into Canada. I really do think this is a call from within the building. I think that people in power are responding to public pressure. They're responding to perceived threats, and ultimately it's ideological. The trans and non-binary community that I know and love actively challenge and disrupt colonialism and white supremacy, and that can be perceived as a threat. And I think that's what we're seeing here to an extent. There's a really immediate impact on mental health that I think we need to talk about. Right now, research is showing that about a third of trans youth will attempt suicide. Half report self-harm. Trans youth are at a 5 to 7 times increase risk of suicidal ideation or attempts. And we're already seeing the effects of this. Distress centers are seeing increased calls, not only from trans kids, but parents. And these trans kids are facing exacerbating factors like homelessness, isolation, lack of support from adults, and as we're seeing here, institutional prejudice. I think transitioning at its core is a way to self-actualize, to be better, to participate in the world. And I think schools are really where the future is made. This is a violation of human rights. The Canada Human Rights Act does not have a special section on minors. It applies to everyone. The only mention of age has to do with, child labor or retirement. So when we're stopping youth from having access to freedom of speech or expression, stopping youth to being able to access evidence-based healthcare that saves lives, transition-related care, it's a clear violation of human rights. And I think this is rooted in the same brutal practice of oppressing Indigenous people and people of color. I think we're in a good position to win this over. I think we have a good track record. Canada has a long-standing history of being a relatively safe place for trans people. There are numerous protections in both the Alberta and national human rights acts. In 2008, when the government tried to delist transition-related surgeries, Albertans fought and won. The Trans Equality Society of Alberta was formed, and we won that funding back, and that was a huge win for the trans community. In 2014, we amended the vital statistics to allow easier changes to gender markers, as well as the X gender marker. And in 2022, we banned conversion therapy. I'd like to remain hopeful, and I don't think that's me being naive. I think we can get on public record, write letters to MLAs, make phone calls, make it really hard for elected officials to ignore us. We might have to prepare for court rulings and litigation because teachers are being asked to either uphold the dignity of trans kids by using their chosen name and pronouns and not out them to their parents, or face criminal charges. And similarly, doctors are being asked to either provide life-saving transition-related care or, or face criminal charges. A third thing I think we can do is maybe corporate advocacy and coalitions, leaning on corporations to take a side. I think writing to professional bodies, professional regulatory bodies like the College of Registered Nurses of Alberta, the Alberta Teachers Association, College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, the College of Psychologists, CAP, I forget what the acronym stands for. These are all potential avenues that I think we should look into. I'll end this thought. Thank you so much. I think we can do this. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Eva. I really appreciate already starting, I think, like with thinking about insidious portions of, or insidious frames of care, and then thinking also about the optimism from inside communities and our allies. I really appreciate that. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Zach Marshall. Zach Marshall is at the University of Calgary.
Hello. Thank you so much for organizing this event, and to the wonderful panel, and for everyone that is here. I was a little bit challenged by the 5 to 7 minutes, and I've gone through what to try to share. So friends have just encouraged me to try to share what sort of seems like the key message right now. And I'm Irish, so I think I need to tell it to you like a story. So I'll begin this way. Last fall, I was away actually visiting family, and I saw on social media that the policy resolutions for the UCP had been released. So I was a little bit worried, but I thought I should look at them so that I could understand, what is coming. Well, in a way, I was strangely surprised, maybe even pleasantly surprised, and I'll tell you why. So there are a lot of policies in the document, but I'm just going to share 3 with you. Policy proposal number 2, and I won't read the whole thing because it's very long, but policy proposal number 2 had the following resolution. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should protect an individual's right to free expression. And then it goes on to say, give some examples of people being censored or persecuted because of their scientific, personal, and or religious beliefs regarding government policies. So I thought, okay, right to expression. I like the sounds of this. Maybe it's not so bad. So then I kept reading, and I got to policy 4. Now, policy 4 is about medical rights, and it says the UCP believes the government of Alberta should protect an individual's right to informed consent decisions regarding their own body, and goes on to say in the rationale, informed consent is the cornerstone of every single medical procedure that is offered in Canada, and autonomy of self is enshrined in Canadian law and upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. And then again, there's a lot of additional information. So I was like, okay, well, this is looking good. Things are looking good for me and my communities. And so then I kept reading, and I got to policy number 15, which I, again, will just share with you briefly here. It talks about infringement protection and urges that the government of Alberta should recognize that Albertans have many endangered God-given rights and freedoms that are not formally affirmed in the Canadian Constitution, its enactments, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so this is the part where things get really interesting, because we start talking about existing fundamental freedoms of thought, belief, expression, and additional rights. So here we have the right to keep arms, parents' rights is mentioned here, the right to self-defense, and then additional freedoms, which include the freedom to make personal health care choices. And so when I read all of these policies, I thought, okay, so, maybe Alberta is a place where we can have the freedom to make decisions about our own health and about our own futures. So the decision that came last week was a bit harder to take, the announcement anyway. So I just want to go over a couple points from there with you. So in the video from the Premier, which I did watch, I noticed a few things that she said. One is that it was her view. So she said, it is my view that this list of adult choices, she's talking a lot about adult choices, pose a risk to a child's future, and that she is not comfortable permitting it in our province. She then says, after much discussion, the government caucus and I have decided to implement the following policies and guidelines. So I don't know if you're like me, but I started to say, well, this kind of contradicts what the other policy said, because in this case, the government is telling us what is going to happen with our personal healthcare decisions. Not only that, they're actually telling parents what to do about their children's healthcare decisions. So while on the one hand, they're framing it as, young people need to have permission from parents and that this is going to be needed in the schools. But in reality, if you think about it, all the parents who do agree with things that are different from what the government is telling us, well, their rights will be taken away as well. So it does leave me in a bit of a quandary, because I am a fairly logical person. I'm a researcher at heart. I'm very interested in trying to make sense of things. And to me, this decision actually flies in the face of the government's own policies and is taking away our freedoms and rights as Albertans. So I think fundamentally, we really need to take a look at who is making decisions for us as people in the province. How are those decisions being made? As I read in those quotes, it doesn't say anything about drawing on a body of evidence or based on current medical guidelines, or, it doesn't say anything about that. It just says, in my view, I am not comfortable after much discussion. And so I think, as well as someone who has studied research with and about trans people for the last 12 years, I really would encourage us to look at what has already been done in this area. All of the work and energy that has already been invested by policymakers, healthcare providers, families, trans and non-binary folks, to come up with what are the current best practices and how those need to continue to evolve over time. So thank you very much. I don't want to take more time than I should.
Thank you so much, Zach. And I just want to reiterate that asking people to talk about their expertise, especially those who have been working in their areas for such a long period of time and have academic lived expertise, organizational skills and capacities, have been doing this work extensively and in an in-depth way. Asking those folks to talk about something for 5 minutes is a very difficult task. I'm just so thankful that any of you are willing to take on that particular challenge. So thank you so much. And the shorter I speak, the more Q&A we get to. So let me move right along. Our next speaker is JJ Wright. JJ is at MacEwan University.
Hi, folks. I just have 2 cats here who are sitting beside me at the computer who I feel are going to knock all of my gear off my desk here. So I'm just going to move at least one of them off the desk. Hi, folks. So I want to first start by situating myself on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. I am an assistant professor of sociology and gender studies. I also want to identify myself as a lesbian, trans non-binary person who's a disabled settler, and I use she, they pronouns. I want to start off tonight by saying that I think that Danielle Smith intentionally released a slew of policies because it forces us to grapple with multiple items, giving us lots all at once to develop arguments against, to speak to news about, and to unpack with our students and broader community. Thankfully, we have a lot of experts talking about a lot of different things today, and tonight I'm going to focus specifically on sex education. My primary area of research is gender-based violence prevention education and sex ed, and I work to develop more effective, inclusive programming in partnership with community-based organizations. So Danielle Smith has introduced this new requirement where any education about human sexuality, to use her term, will now require parental consent. And she also included gender identity and sexual orientation in the list of now prohibited topics. But I want to be clear that she is removing sex education for all youth and across all topics related to human sexuality, unless there's parental consent. And with this, she is micromanaging teachers and other school staff, and she's sending a chill that tells education workers that if parents haven't given their consent and educators impart information to youth about sexual health, these educators or school staff will face repercussions. And I wanted to just raise some of the scenarios where a student might ask their teacher for sexual health information. They might need information about STIs because they're starting to be sexually active, or they might want to know how to prevent pregnancy. Students might want to better understand reproductive organs because their period is starting, or they're curious about it. A student might want resources about sexual orientation or gender identity because they're questioning and they seek affirmation and to know that they're not wrong or bad and that they still belong. But in all of these cases, without parental consent, the person who provided this information or any of this information around these topics could face serious consequences, including being fired. So when I think about Danielle's video, she says that she's concerned about kids and she wants to protect them. But how does this policy on sex ed protect them? In regards to the new policies on gender affirming care, she said she wants youth to be informed about decisions that will impact the rest of their lives. And I ask, how is denying youth information about birth control, STIs, gender and sexual diversity, and consent not going to negatively impact their health and well-being in the long term? So despite the soft tone that she uses in her video, I don't think Danielle cares about queer and trans kids. And I would suggest that perhaps, it's in question even if she cares about straight cis Albertan kids, which we might find evidence in by her denying them information that's essential to their physical, sexual, and mental well-being. So I want to also note that we have decades now of evidence-based research showing that comprehensive sex education is necessary for educating the whole child. And it actually goes against the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child to deny youth comprehensive sex ed, because it is the child's right to learn about sexual health, to promote their well-being across the lifespan. And really, comprehensive sex ed, so education that includes stuff around, not just risk-based stuff, but stuff around consent that's more sex positive. This form of education hasn't really been all that controversial because it's being established as best practice. There was the controversy in Ontario when consent was added into sex ed for the first time under in 2015. But when Doug Ford was elected and he did the consultations that he said he was going to do during the campaign for office, he ended up basically issuing the same exact curriculum and just removed some of the bits about 2S LGBTQ plus folks to later grades. So this was perhaps the first really clear example in Canada of a populist politician appropriating sex ed for their own political gain. And it seems that Smith has followed suit, but in an even more extreme way. We do have decades of research showing that comprehensive sex ed equips youth to navigate increasingly complex sexual landscapes, especially with the advent of the virtual world, TikTok, technology-facilitated violence. Really, sex ed does save lives. It prevents violence. So I want to just speak for a second about Danielle Smith requiring third-party review of all sex ed curricular materials, because that is another piece of the policy around sex ed. This will also send a chill through schools. And this type of third-party review will no doubt end up promoting conservative values like perhaps abstinence until marriage. But we know from decades of research that abstinence-only education increases rates of teen pregnancy and STIs. So this is why we really direly need comprehensive sex education to educate the whole child. I really also want to make sure that I spend a minute talking about sexual and gender-based violence. Without question, when students are not taught about consent or to understand their bodies or their desires, rates of sexual violence will increase. We know that when youth can name body parts, this actually helps, for instance, to prevent child sexual abuse. And when some youth are kept out of sex ed and don't learn about consent, they can then go on to harm youth, other youth, even ones who have gone through sex ed. So parents must not be able to opt their children out of sex ed. It must be mandatory as a matter of public health. And when gender and sexual diversity are made invisible in sex ed, this will increase rates of gender-based violence in schools, in the form of bullying or harassment. And we know already that 70% of trans students, unfortunately, in Canada report dealing with ongoing harassment at school. 70%. That is an astonishing number. It is shameful that the UCP government wouldn't try to protect these kids by offering inclusive teachings about diverse families and identities. And the last thing I'll share in my short time today is just to reiterate that there's decades of evidence-based research that demonstrates that comprehensive sex ed is best practice. And unfortunately, Danielle Smith and the UCP government are at this time choosing to ignore that at the peril of Albertan youth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ. I think what you've made so clear is just how both insidious and also widespread the effects will be. And so while we're specifically thinking about folks who are most vulnerable in the school context, especially trans, non-binary, two-spirit youth, we're also talking about policies that are going to have wide-ranging effects, including on cis and straight children and youth. And so thank you so much for bringing that to the fore. I think this is something that folks need to be really thinking about. So we're going to continue on the education path with Jamie Anderson. Jamie is at the University of Calgary.
Thank you so much, Corinne, Celeste, Mount Royal team, for creating this opportunity to gather and to speak. My name is Jamie Anderson, and I'm a trans teacher with more than 12 years of experience working in K-12 education. And my doctoral research concerns the impacts of policy and public discourses on trans educators and on trans inclusive education in schools. And that's the lens I bring to this conversation tonight. And just on a lighter note, in line with Zach's lovely sense of humor, I've been putting off and procrastinating my ethics proposal for my doctoral research, waiting for something to change. And unfortunately, This is the change that came and has shifted my doctoral research, but I hope that I can kind of focus my energies on engaging in really important conversations and sharing important knowledge so that we can equip educators as best as possible to support every child that enters the school space, especially those trans and non-binary kiddos who are dealing with a lot right now. As an adult, trans educator, trans adult, I'm dealing with a lot right now, so I can't imagine those kids, those families who are making sense of this world that has shifted on them overnight. So I'm just going to focus on, I'm going to focus on 6 overarching concerns during my time, knowing that other folks are kind of addressing interrelated concerns, and knowing, unfortunately, that while we kind of ready ourselves for the actual letter of the proposed policies, we can't really anticipate all of the change that is going to come. First and most immediately, I think the implication of these policy changes on the education system has to do with well-being, discrimination, and discipline in schools. These proposed policy changes threaten school climate, and in connection, they threaten student and staff well-being. Schools will be asked to carve out exceptions to both the Education Act and Alberta Human Rights Act in order to enable the discrimination of trans and non-binary children and youth who don't have parental support in schools. We know that homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic violence in schools affects the well-being of all students, not only those who identify as queer and trans. And so this policy proposal is going to affect the whole school climate. Safety and belonging are preconditions for learning. And so a school climate that enables and enforces rejection is not only going to affect the well-being of students and mental health of those students, but also their academic achievement. And this is especially true, not exclusively to trans and non-binary students, but to all students. Administrators will be tasked with addressing trans-inclusive support as policy non-compliance amongst students and staff. This could mean that discipline policies and procedures have to account for students refusing to dead name their peers, or trans students refusing to respond to their dead name, or teachers for asking for student pronouns, effectively punishing actions that serve as relational and social support to trans and non-binary youth. This could also mean that all students will be put into a position where they're expected to report their teachers or their peers for policy non-compliance. Secondly, a concern around professional obligations and the teacher code of conduct, and this was already mentioned by my other panelists, my co-panelists. The teacher code of conduct currently in Alberta requires educators to respect the dignity and rights of students and ensures that students are protected from discrimination by their educators based on the prohibited grounds in the Alberta Human Rights Act. Name and pronoun policies that apply only to trans and non-binary students are an example of such discrimination that the Act seeks to avoid. And so, of course, it kind of tugs on concerns around, if this policy is to be successfully put in place, there's concern that the Human Rights Act of Alberta is also going to be experiencing some change. In terms of the professional code of conduct, this policy change would codify the discrimination of trans and non-binary students into teacher professional practice in Alberta. Compliance with the code of conduct would require harming trans and non-binary students who do not have parental support. It would also mean potential disciplinary measures for those teachers who do not comply with the policy. And as JJ alluded to, that includes dismissal. And it also risks driving queer, trans, non-binary teachers from Alberta or from the profession altogether. And I think this is true for those teacher allies and teachers with trans family members as well. The language of age-appropriate versus developmentally appropriate curricula is another concern that emerges from Danielle Smith's announcement. The language of age-appropriate has long been used to fuel moral panics concerning gender identity and sexual orientation. Queer and trans contagion theories very much inform these policy changes, with parents believing that simply learning about something will make those students, trans. So learning about trans identities will make them trans, or learning about queer identities will make them queer. And we know in the research that this is emphatically not true. Age appropriateness is deployed by parental rights advocates to suggest that gender and sexual orientation are not appropriate for the school altogether, but are rather a concern of parenting in the home. Therefore, the language age appropriate is actually concerned more with morality and paternalism than with evidence-informed child and youth development research. Developmentally appropriate curricula aligns learning outcomes with developmental ages and stages of children and youth across 4 domains: cognitive, emotional, physical, and social. So for instance, in early childhood education and elementary learning about relationships, we would start with the family and friends, as those are primary relationships in a child's life. In those conversations, we might find out about kids who have families with 2 moms or a trans parent. Also at that age, in early childhood education, early elementary, children are developmentally experiencing their own understanding of their self, and that includes their gender identity. Therefore, actually developmentally appropriate curriculum and learning will be stifled by these proposed policy changes. These proposed policy changes will mean queer and trans identities will be viewed as inappropriate in schools, which will result in erasure and exclusion, significant knowledge gaps. Schools will be unable to teach and prepare students for the actual world that they live in, where we as queer and trans people do exist, we do live, we do flourish, and we are also protected from discrimination. Teaching and learning is another key area of concern. Proposed policies have significant consequences for teacher and learner autonomy. Danielle Smith proposed policies about partnership and learning material review as though that was a policy gap. In reality, current policy has it so that jurisdictions have their own policies and practices and procedures. And what this policy actually does is it usurps the authority of duly elected local school boards to determine the learning materials and partnerships that are relevant to their communities. Despite her suggestion that such content only shows up one day of the year, the K-12 programs of study address themes like family, identity, communities, history, rights, and more across all subject areas, which means queer and trans identities and experiences don't only exist in sexual health education. We know that this will affect the ability of teachers and learners to engage in inquiry and make connections to student lives and student interests because of the need for prior explicit parental permission. This will also undoubtedly lead to censorship and the removal of inclusive materials from libraries, the reduction of teacher autonomy, and I'm also really concerned about the excessive delays for teachers across the province who are required to seek lesson plan and material approvals from the ministry when this such practice is not taken up anywhere in any other subject area. While there were no explicit limitations to gay, straight, and queer straight alliances that were announced, we already know that GSAs will become unsafe and ineffective as a result of restrictions on students and teachers. Those trans and non-binary students without parental support will risk being outed by their teachers or peers for requesting the use of a different name or pronouns, and content is likely to be policed in relation to the opt-in or parental notification policies. And we'll see this really important school-based, student-led support for queer and trans and non-binary students once more at risk and ineffective or ineffectual as a result of these policies. Lastly, the idea that permission forms will be introduced to teacher workload and the implications of that is another important consideration. We learned from our experience with Bill 44 that parental notification requirements for sexual orientation and sexuality content really increased the climate of fear for teachers, and it reduced the likelihood that they would teach about or feel safe to speak about 2S LGBTQIA+ identities at all. The increased workload associated with teaching trans-inclusive curricula will itself be a punishment to those teachers who want to teach explicitly about gender identity and sexual orientation in a developmentally appropriate and curricular-aligned way. So anyone here who in the scope of their work or as an educator who has ever had to collect a signed permission form from a child knows intimately the work that that entails. And we also know the barriers that poses to students. The opt-in policies will create significant gaps in education, especially for students whose parents might have reduced parental social capital as a result of their work responsibilities and time limitations that might impact their ability to sign something on time. Teacher workload will be increased, not just one day a year and not just in relation to sexual health education. And permission forms will increase the experiences of implicit and explicit familial rejection, for those queer and trans youth who may not even bring their permission slips home for fear of that experience of rejection and that conversation, that confrontation that might take place at that time. So I appreciate the time, and I think I've gone a little bit over, so I'm going to wrap up there and pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was really in-depth and really helpful, I think, especially, I know that there's some questions in the Q&A that started already around GSAs and some teacher questions. And of course, as a parent of a trans kid, I was listening very intently to all the outcomes that some of which I hadn't thought of yet. So thank you so much for providing that expertise. We're going to now move on to William Bridle from the University of Calgary. And William, I'm going to do my best to get your slides up.
I'm actually okay not to use them. Thank you.
Are you sure?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate that. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here, and thank you to all of you joining this evening. I'm here as an academic and an openly gay accomplice who has been involved in the sports system in different roles for close to 50 years, the last 20 or so through research and advocacy work. And because I'm talking about sport, I'm actually going to start my stopwatch. It kind of seems to make sense to me. So to begin, I want to make it clear that the sport policy being brought forth by Smith, like others have said of other parts of the policy, is built on misinformation, ideas that have been noted time and again as lacking in evidence and as contravening human rights. The quick points I'll raise in the next 6-ish minutes or so are rooted in years of research, so I'm asking you to trust me a little bit. But I've also had input from members of the Recreation Collective, a group of diverse researchers and sport leaders who I've had the great fortune to collaborate with over the last 5 years or so. I'd like you to know we are currently creating an online resource in response to this proposed policy that should be available later this week, and I'll post the URL in the Zoom chat when I'm done. So over the next few minutes, I just want to touch on some of the key themes that are emerging in this policy discussion through the 7-minute video and then the press conference, themes that are both common and highly problematic. So the first has to do with this idea of authority and who has it. And in the press conference, Smith commented that there is no, quote, no one single answer or authority that we can rely on, end quote. Yet I would suggest that she is, in fact, claiming authority and creating policy that proposes the opposite from what leading experts argue is best or promising practices. Two organizations that I hope you will maybe already be or will become familiar with are the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport and Canadian Women in Sport, who have been champions for trans inclusion in sport for years. Both organizations are clear, along with researchers, that any policy related to trans inclusion should be rooted in the notion that people can participate in sport based on their gender identity, with no requirement of proof, disclosure, or biomedical intervention. The second point, I think I spend a little bit more time on this, is notions of safety and fairness. And I will say that researchers and practitioners do not dispute that there are issues of safety and fairness in women's and girls' sport, but this has nothing to do with trans girls and women participating. The real issues of safety and fairness include things like funding inequities, poor media coverage, lack of women, trans, and non-binary folks in coaching and leadership roles, experiences of microaggressions, discrimination, and maltreatment, and non-inclusive sport environments, policies, and practices. So Smith commented on the creation of co-ed and gender-neutral categories as a way toward, quote, meaningful participation, end quote, of trans athletes. And this is based, I would say, largely on misinformation related to biological strength, which I'll just return to in a moment. But the creation of these categories that are being proposed could force folks to come out as trans or non-binary before they feel ready to do so, or even if they want to, it should never be expected of anybody. This proposal is also a form of segregation that is antithetical to the main reasons cisgender, trans, non-binary, gender-diverse folks want to participate in sport, for the fun, for the exercise, for the social aspect, for the friendships, and for the skill development. This proposal is also highly unrealistic. Given limited resources, it is highly unlikely that, for example, school sport programs or city wheelchair basketball clubs or rural hockey teams will have enough resources and trans participants to field quality opportunities for this third category. In fact, the spreading out of participants and resources could ultimately threaten women's and girls' sport programming. Here, while I want to note there has been no explicit reference to this yet, I think it is important to flag here that many trans exclusionary sport-based policies and laws proposed or passed in the United States in the last couple of years, to which this proposal sounds decently similar, include the right of others to question or challenge someone's gender identity based on appearance and or performance, leading in some cases to genital inspections as proof. We know from years of challenges at the elite level of sport that such a clause will unfairly target racialized girls and women. And so the potential impact of policies that ultimately seek to police gender is vast and really paradoxical to the notion that this proposed Alberta policy is fundamentally rooted in safety and fairness. I noted earlier I was going to return to the notion of advantage or biological strength. And so this so-called advantage thesis is also an ongoing argument that has been refuted, but that continues to inform bad policy writing and public discourse. Smith does this when referring to the creation of this policy to address, quote, biologically stronger transgender women athletes, end quote, and, quote, biological women who are born biologically female, end quote, in sport. 3 points here. First, the very idea of biological female as a clearly defined binary category based on any single quality is unsupported by medical research. Second, the notion of biological advantage in children's and youth sport is basically ludicrous. The normal range of testosterone, often the hormone most blamed for gender differences, are identical for all kids, regardless of their sex. Thus, any differences in sporting abilities at this age are much more attributed to the greater encouragement and opportunities around sporting development offered to boys. Moreover, in sports where body size differences do create significant advantages or personal risk, like boxing or wrestling, weight and skill-based classes are already in effect within both men's and women's sport programs, interventions that acknowledge and protect the wide diversity of athletes. Third, in 2022, CCS released a scientific review in which experts examined research published between 2011 and 2021. The key finding of the study was that there is no evidence that trans women have any sort of advantage over cisgender women in elite sport. The scientific research that exists is flawed methodologically, and additionally, social science research is largely ignored in the creation of harmful and exclusionary policies. On a final note, 4 things that I would love for you to think about doing in the immediate, as even noted previously, write your MLA. Raise your concerns about this policy. If your MLA isn't a member of the NDP, I would suggest copying your NDP rep in your area. Education and awareness is key. Make use of the resources that are free, accessible, and shareable, and share these resources with people in your life who need to read them, people who maybe agree with this policy and or the ideology behind it. Be brave in how you share it. Visibility and representation matter. Stickers, posters, flags, pride tape, statements on websites, coffee mugs, water bottles, pins, whatever you can do to show that your sport is inclusive and welcoming. And if it isn't, let's make it happen. And finally, another step is research-based policy. The CCS has a template that organizations can and do use. There are sport organizations in this province and beyond doing meaningful work, so it is possible. As my last statement, I apologize, I've gone over, trans, non-binary, two-spirit kids, youth, and adults absolutely deserve the right to participate in and gain from the potential physical, mental, and social benefits of sport. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, William. Again, really in-depth and like so concise. It's amazing how succinct folks are being with so much evidence and such long-term careers in this field. So thank you so much for providing your expertise. We're going to now move on to Christopher Wells, who's our next speaker.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you to my colleagues on this call for their wise and eloquent words. I come to you today from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. And I just want to reference back to some of the comments that were made, and certainly what we've seen from Premier Smith is the unleashing of what I've described as a shock grenade, and it's designed to disorient, to confuse, and its fragments to inflict maximum damage. And I think there are so many parts of the policy platform that has been announced that it's hard to unpack and untangle each and every one. Certainly could spend a call on all of them. In fact, Danielle Smith had said there were 10 distinct proposals that she plans to introduce. The good news is they're not being introduced until the fall, as it sounds like. So that does give us time to further unpack, educate, agitate, and mobilize, because we know how important this work is and how damaging these policies are. So I thought what I would do here in this brief amount of time is just to follow one thread and unravel some of the framing that has been used in the discourse. So to take a turn back to history, because much of what we've seen here in this present moment, we've dealt with in the past and successfully defeated. So I wanted to give a little brief overview, a history of parental rights in Alberta. And so going all the way back to 1978, and many people will perhaps remember Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant was the Florida beauty queen who went on to most famously represent orange juice. And so she was seen as a prime opportunity to send a message from the far religious right in the southern United States to reverse ordinances that had been passed in Miami-Dade County that were some of the first to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in public services. And so Anita Bryant and her supporters launched what was called the Save Our Children campaign, with this belief in their famous slogan that says, gays can't reproduce, so they must recruit, that they were coming after our children. And not only did they seek to overturn these sexual orientation provisions, discrimination provisions, they really focused and targeted schools. And this notion, they tried to ban gay and lesbian teachers from being teachers, from being visible within the educational system. And they also tried to ban gay and lesbian individuals from holding public office and representing any public services. So you can see early on, there was this belief of a contagion, of irresponsible, immoral role models in these positions. And it's no mistake, even when we think today about why schools are such a focus. This goes back decades. And these might be deemed to be some of the original Don't Say Gay policies and legislation that were put in place, because, it was seen as a virus that would impact, infect, confuse, disorient what was phrased as vulnerable young children, as though, again, sexual orientation or gender identity was not an inherent facet of your identity. And so what we saw when Anita Bryant brought her Save Our Children campaign to Canada, and one of the first stops in 1978 was in Edmonton. And what was formed was an interesting response all across North America, where coalitions was called the Coalition to Answer Anita Bryant. And it was a diverse coalition amongst people from all facets of society, not just the gay and lesbian community. And so when she brought her particular brand of homophobia to Edmonton in 1978, busloads of people, unions, church groups, faith groups, labor groups, all came together, and they came by the busloads from Calgary to Edmonton. And in fact, they marched. In fact, this would be considered, could arguably be considered Edmonton's first Pride Parade, first largest mass gathering to protect queer rights. And we saw direct activism happen in this case, where in fact some individuals chained themselves to the fence as Anita Bryant was giving her Christian revival concert, focused on, again, demonizing queer individuals. So let me then fast forward. So our community mobilized, it responded, it was visible, and found new ways to build coalitions. Fast forward to 1991, a lab instructor at King's College by the name of Dalwyn Vreend was fired from his job. Again, another educational institution. And Dalwyn went to the Alberta Human Rights Commission to file a complaint against discrimination, and they could not accept his claim because sexual orientation was not in Alberta's Human Rights Act. So fast forward 7 long years where the community mobilized, it raised funds, where the legal case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that sexual orientation must be read into Alberta's Human Rights Act. And that became the last province in Canada to include sexual orientation in its Human Rights Act. So interestingly, at that time, Premier Ralph Klein threatened to use the notwithstanding clause and had such a visceral backlash from Albertans that he backed down. Fast forward 11 years later to 2009, famously under what was called Bill 44, the Alberta government finally wrote sexual orientation into Alberta's Human Rights Act, so it was visible. It took 11 years for them to actually write the words. But they did so by also establishing what was called a firewall. And this is where they established the first parental rights in legislation by saying parents have the right to opt their children out of learning about planned classroom discussions on the grounds of sexual orientation, sexual orientation, human sexuality, and religion. So gender identity was not present at that time. And so you can see how, again, schools become the target. We must protect students from learning about these issues of their identities. They're so dangerous that we have to put restrictions up. So then we move forward a few years later to 2014-15, many of you remember the great GSA debate. And where Danielle Smith, as a member of the Conservative Party of Alberta, spoke so passionately and eloquently in the need to support GSAs, in fact, said they will save lives. So we saw what happened with Bill 10, as it was known, legislating important supports for GSAs in all schools, including Catholic schools, including private Christian schools, should a student request them. But interestingly, what also happened at the same time is Premier Jim Prentice removed the parental opt-out rights on the grounds of sexual orientation. Right? That was taken out because the government knew that it was patently discriminatory. So here we are now at 2024 with newly proposed policies that now will require parents to opt all of their children into any discussions, as we've heard, about sexual orientation, sexuality, and now adding in gender identity. And has been mentioned by several people, including in the chat conversation. It's unclear if this will apply to GSAs, and if we're now back to where we were in 2014 and 15, where students will need parental permission to opt in to attend a GSA. And we know that is part of the goal here. But there was such an outrage and a groundswell that, in fact, many believe that it was this issue that brought down the 40-year reign of the Conservative government in Alberta. That people rallied passionately about the need to protect young people from abuse and discrimination, and that schools need to be safe and inclusive spaces. So this has always been about controlling schools. This has always been about preventing access to sexual orientation and gender identity information, role models, visibility. That's why we see attacks on pride flags, rainbow crosswalks. We've seen hate crimes increase exponentially. We're seeing groups particular cultural communities and religious communities, now targeting schools, walking out of schools in protest. We're seeing hateful protests on our street, targeting libraries, targeting to us LGBTQ communities. And we know they're not done. David Parker, who is the architect behind all of this, and who is in many ways controlling what the premier does because she has such great fear for him. Danielle Smith might be better referred to as the puppet premier because the strings are being pulled elsewhere. But David Parker has blatantly and brazenly said that they're not stopping and they are coming after school boards, that they want to control every school board in the province, because we know if you control schools, you control the future. And so one takeaway, and something people on this call can do, when those school board elections come, run, nominate, be part of the democratic process. You know, at the end of the day, we expect all of our elected officials to pass policies that help kids, not policies that will hurt them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christopher. In pursuit of trying to somewhat get to Q&A, I'm going to go right into the last speaker for today, which is Florence Ashley, who is at the University of Alberta.
So hi everybody, I'm going to speed run this shit, one because I'm tired and slept like caca, and two because we do not have a lot of time. So I'm the law and healthcare ethics person, but today I'm wearing my law hat because we haven't heard about law enough. But before I get into the law stuff, I do want to emphasize that it's not just about fighting back, it's also about fostering the pockets of care, of community, of love and joy that are needed to sustain trans people, to sustain trans youth right now. So that's super important. So don't get too lost in just fighting that bill. Also show up for the trans people here. Now, turning to the law. First of all, do not expect the law to save you. The law is powerful. The law is also extremely weak. So that's something we have to handle. Now, there's very little doubt that the Charter is violated. This violates rights to equality, rights to life, liberty, and security of the person, rights against cruel and unusual punishments, rights to free speech, right to... Look, there's no doubts here, and it's pretty much admitted. What changes everything is whether they invoke the notwithstanding clause. Now, the notwithstanding clause, what that essentially means is that they get to just say, the Charter does not apply to us. The Canadian Charter, all of those rights that we have, does not apply to us. So, this is not the end-all be-all. Just because they invoke the notwithstanding clause doesn't mean that there's nothing to be done, but it sure is hard to get around. There are kind of two things you can do to strike down legislation. You can either say the Charter applies or some other human rights legislation, but they can get an exception to all of those. Or you can say, well, the division of power applies, and this is not provincial power, this is actually federal power. And so you get a lot of these very technical arguments that we can make, and then there are extreme long shots that I will not get into because there are far too long shots. But the technical arguments under the division of power are some of the kind of easier ways to get around the notwithstanding clause. And banning healthcare especially has the most workarounds. And so while there are many things we can do, we have ideas, especially for sports and things like that. We're trying things in Saskatchewan, in New Brunswick, around the pronoun policies and all of that. But for healthcare, that's where we have the most workarounds. Why? Two things. The first thing is the Canada Health Act. The Canada Health Act is not constitutional, but it is a ton of money that the federal gets to decide if the provinces get. And if the provinces do not respect the Canada Health Act, for instance, by banning medically necessary care, then the federal government gets to say, you do not get that money. And that is going to hurt enough that it's going to make it really unlikely for Danielle Smith to actually keep going unless she wants to start an all-out war around all of healthcare insurance, which I'm sure she's not super thrilled about, but who knows, it's Danielle Smith. The second thing is there is a case to be made by saying that a ban on healthcare is part of the criminal law power, that essentially trying to ban trans youth care is effectively criminalizing it. And if you can make that argument, well, criminal law is actually exclusively the power of the federal government. Provinces do not get to make criminal law. They can send people to prison for stuff, but they can't make true crimes, so we have a precedent, Morgenthaler, 1993, Supreme Court decision about abortion. They had tried to limit abortion by saying we're banning abortion outside of hospitals. And what the Supreme Court came back and said, hey, look, you have this serious punishment. Like, it's not just a little bit of time in prison. It's like a long time in prison. And it's aimed at limiting conduct that you consider socially undesirable. That looks like a criminal law. That's kind of the flag of a criminal law, is we're banning something because we don't like it, as opposed to regulating something to make sure it's done right. When you're in that category, then the court says, that's criminal law. Provinces cannot do that. And so that's an argument we can try to deploy here. The risk is, of course, that if Pierre Poilievre gets elected, that won't be worth a whole lot, because he gets to just he gets to pass criminal law, right? And he gets to use the notwithstanding clause and pass a criminal law. So he doesn't have that limit. But until we get there, when it comes to the province, we do have that angle. So what do we do for now? Well, the first thing I think is the most important to do is really fight like hell to ensure that they do not invoke the notwithstanding clause and stand by their decision, right? Because if they say this is in the best interest of the child, all right, prove it in court. And if you can't prove it in court, then let it go. So that's the kind of first thing we want to do, is really ensure that they, as much as we can, do not invoke the notwithstanding clause. Another thing is to really emphasize the threat to other rights and how it's a really dangerous precedent, hugely dangerous precedent on abortion. Also, hugely dangerous precedent in terms of using autistic youth for a moral panic, saying, oh, they are preying on autistic youth, let's remove the autonomy, let's remove the rights of autistic and other disabled youth. Extremely dangerous. And so highlighting these dangers is really an important part of the fight. And then the next thing is, do your darn best to make trans lives happy and livable until we win, because it might take a while. So we need to cherish the trans youth around us, the trans adults around us, while we go through that fight, because it's going to be a minute. It's probably not going to be something we'll fight and be down within the year. So we really need to, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. If you wear yourself out now, that's not going to go well. And then the last point I want to make is, make the law a pain in the ass to enforce. Find the loopholes, seek them out, put up endless barriers to actually enforcing the law. Whenever the government asks you to do something, just go like, put it in writing. Come back in 5 working days. Just make it painful as possible to make the law work. Sue under family law. Do all the steps that you can to just make it extremely painful for the government, and so make it extremely difficult for them to enforce the law, because that's what we need right now. And that's 7 minutes, so I'm done.
Thank you. I'm just going to unspotlight you. There we go. And there are a number of questions in the chat, so we won't have time to get to everyone. We should be ending more or less at 7:30. But I'd like to highlight one comment and I think one question each that goes to our realms of education, sports, and healthcare. So one comment that was recently added says, this is not a question, but a note that the AFN and the AFN Two-Spirit Council are stepping up and pushing back against this and other policies, etc., that have been enacted by Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. These policies go against the calls for justice that were presented in the final report of the MMIWG2S report. So thank you for sharing that. We have a question directly for JJ somewhere in this lineup. Give me a moment. Okay. Corinne, I have completely lost that question. I'm going to ask the first question while I find the second question. So there was a question early on in the presentation, and Florence, this might be one for you, just maybe explaining a little bit more specifically. So can someone explain how these policies can be enforced? How can the government prevent me, a family physician, from providing gender-affirming care to mature minors who have the capacity to consent?
Yeah, so the answer is simple, and it is because they just can. So basically, they can kind of do whatever they want, and they can put up more or less any punishment they want, so long as they don't kind of tip into that category of criminal law, which is primarily defined by the intention and the purpose of the law. The fact that there's a punishment is not necessarily an indication that it's outside of what they can do. And we already see that all the time, right? Like so many of the fines you get, like, you know, the parking ticket, but also like things like going to jail for violating health and safety and stuff like that. Most of that is provincial law. So they can actually like put very severe penalties on it, and to make things even more fucked, it's much easier. The standard of criminal law is very different for those for provincial offenses, and it's actually easier to prove. So yeah, they can just do that, and they can absolutely override mature minor, assuming they use the notwithstanding clause. If they don't, then mature minor is a constitutional right, and will essentially, if there's a violation of that, they will strike down the law. But assuming they invoke the notwithstanding clause, they get to just do that. They get to just violate the Constitution. And that's kind of what's fucked about the notwithstanding clause.
Thank you very much. I'll move on. JJ, I think you answered that question for you by chat, so it disappeared for me. So I'll move on to another question. So as a trans non-binary sports recreation professional, do the panelists know of any work done that is geared towards advocacy and education campaigns on trans inclusion in sports? So William, this may be one for you.
I'm sorry, I didn't actually hear most of the question.
Oh, that's okay. I'll speak up. So as a trans non-binary sports recreation professional, do the panelists know of any work being done that is geared towards advocacy and education campaigns on trans inclusion and sports?
Sure. So just briefly, and I'll just reiterate that some of these resources will be available through the work that we're doing with the Recreation Collective website. But Canadian Women in Sport have some excellent resources available, and have for many years. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport as well. Wow, I'm just drawing a blank on the Canadian Centre for Sexual and Gender Diversity has some workshops available as well. There's quite a bit of information out there, and so I would encourage you, if you can just wait maybe a few days, and we'll be able to provide you with direct links to that.
Wonderful, thank you. And we had a number of questions asking for advice on different resources, so I popped into the chat. But if you subscribe to the critical email list, we will make an effort to compile some resources to send out at some point after the panel. And I think for the last question, JJ, I know you answered to the individual, but just to make sure everyone gets some of your response. So a question was asked, I can also foresee social isolation from the conversations between children and their peers about why or why not their parents opted into sex education and the bullying and outing that can come from that. If queer non-binary kids are not welcome in school while telling the truth of their lives, do you foresee trans violence and dropout rates skyrocketing according to your gender violence research?
I'm happy to read my response, Celeste. I just have to go right at 7:30. So I didn't want to miss out on being able to answer, because I thought it was a great question. So what I said was, based on existing research, we can expect that if Smith's policies move forward, both experiences of mental distress and rates of gender-based violence will increase, which will result in trans students struggling academically. So it is a bleak picture if things move forward, if the bill moves forward. But with that said, I also wanted to highlight my research on queer and trans joy and the incredible power that queer and trans joy has, especially when it's shared among youth, to disrupt systems of violence and foster perseverance. And so if folks were interested in learning more about the disruptive power of queer and trans joy, I invited folks to connect with me on Instagram, and I've left my handle down there in the chat. Thanks for the great question.
Wonderful. Thank you, JJ. And we are nearing 7:30. I think for folks in other parts of the country, it's even later. So I'm going to invite Corinne to see if we have any last words. Otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, all of the panelists for agreeing to do this, especially, responding so quickly and over the weekend. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our note takers and Zoom co-host and our ASL interpreters and everyone who supported the event and made time to come out. It was a really fantastic showing. Corinne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that in the Q&A, Liza has said that folks, I think in the Edmonton context might, if they're looking for people to meet at the school walkout tomorrow at the University of Calgary, to meet at the Rainbow Steps of Mac Hall at 10 a.m. to support the student walkout and to bring banners and snacks and share. And I think that's a beautiful way to end our conversation tonight. We didn't get to everybody's questions, and I apologize about that. I think, again, this is the first of many knowledge sharing spaces that will be organized by folks in the community and folks with a variety of expertise. I think that one of the things that we can all do is just to be together. And I think having those caring relations and really like solidifying our community connections in this moment is such a brilliant and resistant way that we can show Danielle Smith and her folks, whoever's puppeteering behind Danielle Smith, just how strong we are and how much love and joy that we have in community. So I will end it there. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you again to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us tonight. And thank you for spending time with us on this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
So we need more law stuff, because I feel like people have law questions.
Yes.
So much law questions.
Unfortunately, there is all of me in Alberta. That's not true. I actually have great allied colleagues that I'm sure would be very happy to joining and talk, but it gets nerdy. And the thing is, there's a lot of unknown, as in, I talked about the division of power and stuff like that, and the criminal law power. And that's about as straightforward as it gets. But there's a lot of like 600 IQ, 6-dimensional chess shit you can try. How likely is it to work is very low, but oh yeah. So for attendees, if you decide to do more stuff. All right, I'm gonna head out.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, we're all exhausted for so many reasons. So thank you so much for coming here anyways. We're so appreciative of your time. Thank you. And we'll connect again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you very
If
much.
ever anyone,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm going to end us.